Well, good afternoon. Warm welcome to this webinar by the Singapore College of Insurance in partnership with the International Underwriting Association of the UK. My name is Perry Tan. I'm the head of technical training at the Singapore College of Insurance. Once again, a warm welcome to all of you. Today, this webinar is entitled Insights from the London Market, Emerging Risks and Strategic Responses. Next slide, please. Thank you. Allow me to just briefly touch on the speakers that has graced the occasion for today. We will have here from Christopher Jones, who is the CEO of the IUA of London. Chris started his career in the insurance industry in 2000 and was previously IUA's Director of Legal Underwriting and Claims. He's also a qualified company secretary and was recently appointed as IUA's Chief Executive. Joining Chris today is, of course, Tom Hughes, who is the Director of Underwriting at IUA of London. Tom is responsible for underwriting committees and services, and he focuses on promoting and highlighting excellence in innovation in underwriting practices across the company market in London. So today we will have two speakers, Tom and Chris, respectively. Next slide. Okay, just a couple of courses for us to focus on a bit later, but here is the synopsis of today's event. We are facing uncertain times now as emerging risks emerge, from cyber threats to ESG pressures and geopolitical shocks. So this webinar will offer valuable insights into these matters, and especially we will gain an insight into how the London market is responding to these developments. Next slide, please. Okay, here are some courses you may be interested. We have business interruption insurance coming up. We have a very interesting course coming up in October, which is managing a softening market. So that's something that you want to check out. We have CAR, EAR insurance, and of course, courses in marine. If you wish to find out more about these courses, please check with us or go to the SCI website. Next slide. Okay, thank you. So without much further ado, let me hand it over to our first speaker for today. He's none other than Tom Hughes of IUA. Just a reminder that if you have any questions for the speakers, please just type it into the Q&A chat box, right? Enter your questions in the Q&A chat box. So over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Perry, and thank you for having us. Thank you very much to everyone for joining. So Chris and I will be jointly presenting the session today, but I'm going to start just by briefly telling you why we are here. And there's three important questions that we're planning to answer during the session. The first is, how do we view key emerging risks impacting insurers and reinsurers? Second, how are those risks being tackled by London, both from a strategic underwriting and product innovation perspective? And finally, we'll take a moment to look at how underwriters in Asia can engage with the London market. Now, there is one other important question that we should probably answer before we get going, as you may be wondering, and that is, what is the IUA? And I think for that, we'll pass over to Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And good afternoon to everyone on the call. Great to be here. Yeah, so looking at IUA on screen there, you have a pictorial representation of our 80 plus members. We're a trade association, as Perry mentioned in the introduction. Our members, we represent members in the wholesale, non-life business, insurance and reinsurance, and representing the company market. That is the market outside of Lloyd's, although a number of our members have Lloyd's platforms as well. To give you some context of the size of the London market premium company, it's around 48 billion. Combined with Lloyd's, that is around just over 100 billion pounds. And the international nature of our association, of our 80 plus members, the vast majority of those are non-UK parented. So we have interests and parent companies all over the world. We have three main business objectives. Our overall mission statement is securing an optimal trading environment for IUA members. But what does that mean in practical terms? three areas really: digitalization, market modernization, driving an agenda promoting such. We have a legal and regulatory function, representation, whether that's with regulators here in the UK or EU or more widely, or governments, particularly here in the UK. And then the cornerstone of what we do is delivering knowledge and expertise for the innovative underwriting and claims handling. And I would actually add a fourth, perhaps unofficial objective of ours, and that's talent retention and training. And we'll come on to that in some detail shortly, but suffice to say that talent is becoming a huge issue, particularly attracting and then retaining talent in the insurance market. And I think London is no different to other insurance hubs. So if we move to our next slide, so what Tom and I have done, and there's no sort of league table here of what's more risky than others. It's Tom and I just evaluating what I would say is our kind of top 8 risks that we're seeing at the moment, and we're going to take each in turn. So we'll flip between Tom and myself. And the first one,
Chris,
our risk number.
if I may, just for a moment before we jump into the first one, we need to briefly mention our definition of emerging risk. And you're absolutely right that this is really just us putting our heads together to come up with our top 8. But there are many definitions out there, and I think it is important just to stop and try to define what we mean when we talk about emerging risks. Now, one definition we find particularly useful is from the International Risk Governance Council, and they actually issued this in 2017. And they broadly suggest that an emerging risk is a new risk or a familiar risk in a new or unfamiliar context. And they actually introduced 3 helpful categories for us to bear in mind. So the first is risks with uncertain impacts, and a good example there is PFAS. The second is risks in complex interconnected systems. So here we're thinking about something like systemic cyber. And then finally, risks resulting from changes in context. So perhaps consider worsening flood events due to climate change. And as Chris gets into the top 8, it's worth noting that we'll try and answer a question as we go, which is how the London market is tackling each of these emerging risks. And if I'm not wrong, before we get going, I think we're going to launch our first poll to get your view on a couple of areas before you have the opportunity to hear ours.
Yes, Darren, please bring up the poll number 1, please. Thank you.
Here we go. So the first poll on screen for you will give you a few moments to answer. So how confident are you in your organization's ability to respond to emerging global risks in the next 12 months? All responses are anonymized, so please do provide your honest assessment. The responses range from very confident down to unsure.
We'll give 10 seconds and then we will close the poll. Okay, let's close the poll.
Excellent. Okay, here we go. So 10% of respondents, very confident, robust strategies in place. Of course, very pleasing to see. And then some assessments across somewhat confident and not confident, around 53 and 20% respectively. And then 16% of people on the call unsure, so still assessing our risk posture. I'm imagining that most companies out there sit somewhere in that middle bracket. Okay, well, thank you all very much for engaging. And Chris will get going with our first risk.
Yes, thank you, Tom. So looking at risk 8 here, and this is ESG and the anti-ESG dynamic. So environmental social governance, as we know, ESG takes many forms: climate change, social issues such as forced labor, and governance issues such as board control, shareholder activism, and of course, greenwashing. It's a wide range of underwriting risks. One commonality, though, we see is a lack of consistent risk data, and also often areas around or difficulties around due diligence. And sometimes in some industries, the risk say for fossil fuels, is it actually inherent to a core insured risk? So if, for example, in the aviation and marine markets, the use of fossil fuels is actually core to that risk, and it would be difficult to underwrite those risks at the moment without having those exposures. So that there are some inherent difficulties in certain classes of business. If we look at ESG from a separately environmental, we'll talk a little more on this later in the presentation. But for environmental, we've certainly seen increased frequency and severity of physical damage claims. Managing the transition risk from fossil fuels to net zero is also a challenge for underwriters. And we have increased litigation risk, certainly around attribution around climate change and shareholder derivative claims. Concentrating on the social aspects, we have reputational risk for insurers, and certainly in London, we've seen increased regulatory interventions. From the governance perspective, board engagement is key. We mentioned greenwashing in the slide here. Looking at statistics from this year, we've had a 30% increase in the number of greenwashing claims, even though actually there's only been around a 12% decrease in the companies linked to it. So we're seeing more activity for greenwashing, and that really links into a D&O perspective. We're seeing more ESG reporting and disclosure requirements, again, a potential D&O issue. We've talked about ESG there, but what about the ESG, anti-ESG, and essentially beware the anti-ESG backlash? And what do I mean by that? That's manifests itself in a number of ways. We're seeing shareholder activity around failure to maximize profits, fiduciary duties, again, a D&O. So this is where companies are prioritizing ESG practices, often to the expense of maximizing profits. We've seen market access issues in the US, particularly a number of states have taken action against insurers who have taken a view to boycott fossil fuel industries. We've seen some discrimination lawsuits against coal, oil, and gas industries. And we've also seen competition law issues around combined market approaches to net zero. So it's an ESG, anti-ESG. It's a difficult position for insurers to be in. But what are we doing in London? If we look at, there's obviously growing costs for insurers around ESG liabilities. So we're looking at coverage, and that may mean in some cases policy exclusions and limitations. We see this in forced labor, illegal fishing, elements of climate change litigation. We're also seeing increased questioning around ESG credentials in prop forms and broker submissions. We're making the case for transition to assist existing industries, but also supporting new industries. We've seen a huge increase in renewables, and also in things like alternative fuels and marine. And finally, we're looking at regulatory evolution. As I said previously, we're seeing more requirements around reporting. We expect in the UK anti-greenwashing rules from our regulator, the FCA, and that's something we need to be cognizant of. So Tom, over to you.
Yeah, so in at number 7, we have social inflation, which is encompassing class action lawsuits, nuclear verdicts, and litigation funding, somewhat connected to item number 8 Chris just mentioned. Now, according to the CMS, there were 133 European class actions filed in 2023, and that was up from 69 in 2019, so a significant increase. But why does this matter to us? Well, inevitably, liability insurers may be directly impacted by defense costs, settlements, or judgments, and this can lead to unexpected claim spikes, reserve adjustments, or loss ratio deterioration. Now, secondly, class actions often signal emerging risks to us, including several that are in our top 8. Think about things like ESG and greenwashing, environmental liability claims, data privacy breaches, and consumer protection issues. Often we see these emerging risks coming through in class action lawsuits around the world. And finally, class actions can set legal precedents that affect how insurance policies are interpreted, changing our understanding of how those policies will respond to specific emerging risks in future in the eyes of the courts. Now, what's fueling increased class action lawsuits? Well, one key factor that we need to mention is litigation funding. Litigation funding, also known as third-party funding, is where a third party, normally with no prior connection to the litigation, agrees to finance some or all of the legal costs of the litigation in return for a fee payable from the proceeds recovered by the funded litigant. And of course, that has a very important function, which is supporting access to justice. But it's important to balance that absolute need for access to justice, which of course is there, and an increasingly uncertain and costly claims environment that we see in many jurisdictions, particularly the US, in Australia, and increasingly in the UK. Now, from a London perspective, we responded to a Civil Justice Council consultation, which encouraged greater regulation of funders. They then issued a landmark report just a month or so ago in June, recommending statutory regulation of third-party litigation funding, which would replace the current self-regulatory regime that we have. So from an insurer perspective, we regularly meet with legal representatives to try and understand how class actions and funding trends are expanding across different jurisdictions. And of course, insurers and reinsurers covering the activities of multinational companies in jurisdictions like the US are seeking more and more information on those activities to better understand, analyze, and manage emerging risks. Now, of course, we'll be enhancing claims reserving models to account for the growing scale and complexity of funded litigation. If we then look forward, insurers might be taking the opportunity to revisit D&O, professional indemnity, commercial liability policies to clarify coverage around legal costs in the context of funded litigation.
Thanks, Tom. Moving on to risk number 6, and this is looking at the effects of protectionism, tariffs, trade, and supply chain risk. Very fluid, particularly when we talk about tariffs, but we have seen an overall trend of increased protectionism over the last couple of years, certainly damaging to global trade and the insurances that rely on free trade and market access, particularly here around marine, construction risk, etc. And we see the macroeconomic impact of tariffs and protectionism more generally. And we see that in increased inflation, and that flows through into increased claims costs in our sector. To take some data, and again, it's a fluid situation, but we've seen from January to May this year, tariffs rising from around 3%, US tariffs, I should say, rising from around 3% to around 12%. Swiss Re, in a recent report, put forward some projections around global GDP growth. It will slow to 2.3% this year, down from 2.8% last year. And gross written premium, global gross written premium, around 2% growth this year, down from 5.2% in 2024. We're also seeing increased cyber risk in supply chains. The number of incidents has risen significantly over the last 2 years. If we look at in principle around tariffs and certainly what that means for the insurance risk, essentially certainty for insurers equals manageable risk. If we know what the tariffs are going to be, we can build that into our assessments, our underwriting assessments, and our pricing mechanisms. But how do we increase that certainty in what is an uncertain landscape? Well, a couple of areas. Certainly, risk management tools. We're seeing far more sophisticated use of scenario modeling for geopolitical disruption, for cyber attacks, for raw material shortages, for supply chain. We're certainly seeing real-time data integration, monitoring supply performance, logistics bottlenecks, the use of AI and predictive analytics to anticipate failures across supply chains are also importantly and more frequently used. Product innovation, we look at risks here primarily, but these risks are also opportunities. We're seeing the great ease of parametric insurance for supply chain triggers, port closures, cyber breaches, etc. Contingent BI cover, we're seeing enhancements around supplier risks, trade credit, political violence, political risk, protecting against defaults from regulatory shifts and particularly in volatile areas. Cyber, particularly requiring cyber hygiene audits for insured key suppliers, having cyber clauses in supply chain policies, supporting clients with incident response. These are all innovations that insurers here in London are building into their thinking. And certainly from a policy clause point of view, as we try and build in the effect of tariffs, we're seeing claims reserving provisions and policy and increased policy limits reflecting the increased regime. That's picking up on protectionism. Our next risk, number 5, is looking at pollution risk, silent exposures in non-environmental policies. And I'm going to use 2 examples here to make our case for the size of this risk: PFAS and microplastics. PFAS, as people may know on the call may know, are called forever chemicals. They're used in a huge range of products, from your frying pan to your tennis rackets, and as such have a potential systemic risk for insurers. It has many similarities to asbestos, long tail exposures, the potential body injury, but there is a key difference, and that's PFAS is extremely difficult and expensive to clean up. And sometimes in some industries, there are just no immediate alternatives to it. We see that in aviation with the use of firefighting foams contains PFAS, but there is not an alternative. So at present, they're embedded into that industry. Just to give you a bit of context, some data, cleanup costs. Research suggests that the cleanup costs across Europe, and this is a sizable number, could reach 1.6 trillion pounds. That's a massive number. Now, we're not obviously saying that's an insured exposure, but certainly the cost of cleanup across Europe that's huge. And we are seeing some very sizable settlements in the US over the last year or two. Around $18 billion has been paid out by PFAS manufacturers. Based on known settlements, and that's mostly in the chemicals, water utilities, waste management industries. So a sizable issue, and we see that exporting into other markets. What are we doing in London? Obviously, this huge exposure gives pause for thought, particularly in the non-environmental policy world, so general liability, product liability, and we are seeing some exclusions. We are also seeing some updated pollution definitions of PFAS, what it means. And we're seeing industry-specific approaches, premium adjustments, requiring PFAS mitigation programs, and consulting with clients to build those bespoke PFAS solutions. Reinsurers also are putting in place exclusionary language in some areas. For existing policies, we're seeing reserving movements for legacy exposures. So obviously, this is one to watch. Looking at microplastic pollution is plastic waste, essentially. We see it in a number of areas in the non-marine and marine world, and similar type issues for the general liability market and environmental contamination, D&O. We see it in marine and health risk. We've seen some greenwashing claims around microplastics. We've seen some environmental impact lawsuits where local governments suing plastic producers over environmental damages caused by plastic waste. This is, again, primarily in the US. There are some coverage issues. Certainly, there's some challenges for insurers on determining whether there's harm, what the coverage triggers are, what the definitions are, what defining the number of occurrences, where damage occurs over a period of time. Is it one common occurrence? We're seeing tightening pollution exclusions in non-environmental policies, some aggregation, sublimits of microplastics. And again, picking up on the similar to PFAS, we're seeing risk mitigation dialogue with clients, whether that's filtration systems or supply chain assessments. As with PFAS, though, and generally around pollution, there are opportunities, and particularly for the environmental impairment liability market. So I'm going to pass over to Tom, who's picking up our risk number 4.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So in at number 4, increasing natural catastrophes attributed to climate change. And it's worth pausing for a moment to consider the scale of the problem in hand. Now, a State of Wildfires report noted that in Canada, almost a decade's worth of carbon emissions from fire were recorded in a single fire season. That was 2023 to 24, more than 2 billion tons of CO2. More recently, turning to Europe, in the autumn of 24, we saw huge flooding in Italy and Poland, and particularly severe flooding in Valencia, which triggered Spain's extraordinary risk insurance scheme, the state-owned insurance compensation consortium. Now, these are just a couple of examples, and it's fair to say we probably could have spent the entire hour providing just examples of these kind of events. But importantly, we need to mention here the protection gap and really ask the question, are these disasters covered? Now, we had a look, and according to an Aon report, there's a global protection gap of 60% for natural disasters, i.e. 60% of economic losses are not covered by insurance. That's down from 69% in 2023, again, according to Aon. Now, the protection gap can be particularly prevalent in poorer countries. Now, if we turn to the Asia Pacific region, a 97% protection gap was highlighted in the report. Estimated damages were in the region of $74 billion, with insurance covering approximately $4 billion. I think the main driver here was flooding. Now, from a US perspective, it was widely reported that Lloyd's estimated 2.3 billion in net losses from the LA wildfires. And of course, the London market is the largest writer of excess and surplus lines business in the US. Increasingly severe and frequent events may result in reviews of policy wordings, be that around triggers or event language. But we are seeing some examples of specialty coverage for climate resilient infrastructure, opportunities to incentivize climate resilience. And of course, we should mention AI-powered modeling, which we think will have an important role to play in this space. Now, at the other end of the coverage spectrum, we need to mention that there is a broad exclusion available, and that's climate change exclusion LMA 5570, focusing specifically on the costs of climate litigation. We understand at present it's not in too significant use at the moment. Now, no emerging risk list would be complete without cyber threats, so we took the opportunity to slot this in at number 3. Now, 612,000 UK businesses identified a cyber breach or attack in the past year, according to the UK government, and that's a fairly sizable number. From an insurance perspective, on non-standalone cyber coverages, so traditional policies, we've seen a gradual shift to affirmative policy coverage over time, and that's largely been driven by regulators. In many traditional policies now, you see a distinction between malicious cyber acts and non-malicious accidental cyber incidents, and that's an opportunity for insurers to manage coverage across those two separate exposures. There is broader ongoing consideration of systemic connected risk, and that might be in respect of aircraft, vessels, or vehicles, primarily focused on considering whether multiple connected assets can be impacted simultaneously in a malicious cyber event, and that would be particularly concerning to our reinsurance members. Now, from a standalone cyber perspective, the growth in the UK cyber insurance market continues, but work is needed to shift the view of cyber insurance from a luxury to a necessity, and sometimes large public events can have that effect and push us in that direction. And one notable event that comes to mind was relating to Co-op and M&S. So in April of 2025, Marks and Spencer's in the UK and Co-op were hit by a coordinated cyber attack attributed to the cybercrime group Scattered Spider, allegedly. Now, the Cyber Monitoring Centre in the UK classified the incident as a Category 2 systemic event. That means that it had a narrow but a deep impact, which severely impacted upon two companies and their ecosystems. Now, the impact of that were estimated financial losses of over £270 million, fairly sizable, disruption to critical business functions, and customer data exfiltrated. Now, insurance implications, well, the event was treated as a single combined cyber event by the Cyber Monitoring Centre that I mentioned before, and that's potentially significant for cyber insurance aggregation clauses. Insurers may treat this as one loss event across both companies. Now, the insurance industry will closely be monitoring this case as it, of course, tests the limits of systemic cyber risk and policy wordings around coordinated attacks. And there are some important learnings in there around supply chain, social engineering, and business interruption. Now, moving forward, at number 2, artificial intelligence and growing automation. We found this image of a friendly robot. Now, this is inherently linked to our number 3 risk, which was increasing cyber. Now, when it comes to AI, there is a question as to whether we should be calling it IA, the intelligent assistant. We've heard that said before. But having a look at the data we've got at the moment, a McKinsey survey suggested that 78% of respondents said their organizations use AI in at least one business function in 2025. And it was a little bit earlier this year, so the number might have gone up. And that was 55% in 2023. Now, Risk Connect ran a 2024 survey, which set out some challenges that we should have in mind. Only 8% of organizations felt prepared for AI and AI governance risks. It's a very low percentage. Only 16% said they had budgets specifically directed at mitigating AI-related risk, and 19% have formally trained or briefed their entire organization on Gen AI risks. Now, what are those risks? Well, we should be thinking about things like deepfakes and the impacts of blackmail and extortion, reputational damage and liability exposures, misuse of AI for disinformation and societal instability. There's IP infringement, algorithmic bias, AI-driven errors, model bias, and hallucinations. You can see that the list goes on. There's even the concept of AI washing, where companies exaggerate or misrepresent their use of AI. Now, from a London market perspective, we'll consider AI in two ways: the use of AI and then coverage for AI. So when it comes to using the tool, there's no better way to understand these risks than through testing and use. And from a claims handling perspective, we see this as a prime business area for AI integration and support of the function, with faster processing opportunities, cost reductions, and fraud detections, all possible perceived benefits. From the underwriting standpoint, we'll talk a little bit about Smart Follow later, but it's worth mentioning that there has been an AI-powered syndicate in Lloyd's for a few years now, able to provide brokers with a quote in under 10 seconds in some areas. Now, AI is of course used for underwriting support functions, whether that's summarizing reports, providing risk scores, or suggesting specific clauses to be added to policies. From a client standpoint, we know that they are actually using AI tools, Gen AI tools, I should say, to compare and contrast insurers' coverage and policy wordings across different jurisdictions, which is a really interesting use case. Now, when it comes to covering AI, the market is exploring where exposure will reside, and there are comparisons here to silent cyber, with concerns on aggregation and systemic risks through growing AI use. And there's two different schools of thought. One is the traditional coverage perspective, the fact that AI may not inherently change the covered risk, but rather change the magnitude of the exposures that we have, and therefore models and prices can adapt accordingly. But there has been some discussion around evolving AI exclusions. We haven't seen significant use yet, but were we to see them, there'd be an even stronger argument for standalone and specific AI coverages, which is the second school of thought in the market at the moment. Now, traditional products inevitably weren't designed with AI in mind, and there are some unique risks that we've mentioned. So this could lead to gaps in cover for losses involving AI. And you might then see demand for specific tech, E&O, and AI liability coverages aimed at providing support for the manufacturer and also for companies that are implementing and using AI tools. If we step back for a moment, responsibility around AI use as a company, for example, a financial advisor, whether you're training a human or you're training a Gen AI tool to interact and advise your clients, it's still the company's responsibility to manage that customer experience. At least that's our suggestion as to how this might pan out.
Okay, so we're at risk number one, and unsurprisingly, it's geopolitical risk and war. We see it mostly manifest in Russia, Ukraine, and the situation in the Red Sea. We certainly have wider global tensions and actually increasing concerns over potential contagion. Obviously, we've seen issues with Iran, and regional stability in Europe is certainly a concern. Some sobering data. 1 in 8 people are estimated to have been exposed to conflict in 2024. In the last 12 months, over 164 significant anti-government protests worldwide. And if we look at the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, global economic uncertainty is 20% higher in 2025 than in 2020. Against this backdrop, what are we doing in London? Well, certainly we're having increased and more intensive risk assessment processes. We have well-established security data infrastructure within the marine market and also aviation markets. So we have listed areas of heightened risk for vessels traveling in certain jurisdictions. We are reviewing or have reviewed policy clauses around auto-termination, particularly in the marine and aviation space. Product lines delineating between all risks and war policies. Everyone will be acutely aware of the ongoing aviation litigation, but that has certainly served to cause pause for thought around how all risks and war policies interact. But again, and it's a theme through our presentation, that a risk also drives opportunities. So the war risk market is reacting to some of these developments. We're seeing more contingent BI cover in place, certainly an expansion of political violence and strike riots and civil commotion coverage, where we include non-traditional triggers such as social media driven flash protests, politically motivated cyber attacks. We're also seeing increased parametric use around predefined indicators around protest density, curfews, etc. So there are opportunities there. In terms of managing risk and mitigating risk, we're absolutely seeing advanced risk modeling and scenario planning, insurers using geospatial analytics, AI to map protest zones, simulate political violence effects on insured assets. Scenario planning includes election-related unrest, trade wars, terrorism resurgence, and particularly in high density commercial areas. And the consequence of that is looking at underwriting adjustments, regional differentiation. So as you may expect, we're applying differential pricing dependent on the location, and certainly differing limits based on exposure to geopolitical flashpoints and sector-specific processes. So we're looking around retail, looking logistics, and energy industries. Geopolitics is absolutely the number one macro risk. There are difficulties for insurers because it's a fluid situation, but I think we have increasing risk management tools in place and also opportunities for the market to thrive in very difficult and sobering circumstances. So that's our 8 risks. I think I'm going to hand back to Perry, who's going to do a short introduction for the September event, and then I think we'll introduce our second poll, I think it is. So Perry, back to you.
Thank you, Chris. Darren, can I ask you to? Yes, thank you so much. All right. Thank you, Chris. This is just to highlight a very exciting event coming up in September. Chris, we will be coming to Singapore, and this is the SCI IUA underwriting forum. Is on the 5th of September, in person in Singapore. The venue and time is shown here. These are the speakers and the topics. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers. And just to let you know, as of this time, we already have 110 people sign up for this event. 110 people are waiting to see you, Chris, in Singapore in September, and we still have several seats left. So if you wish to sign up for this event, please scan the QR code. This is a complimentary event, right? It's free of charge, and you're welcome to attend. Okay, thank you. So without much further ado, let me hand it over back to Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Perry. And good news is there's 2 other really great speakers on that agenda. So I think it should be a great event. So we're going to move to our next poll. I think, Darian, have you got that on screen? There we go. So which of the following is currently your top underwriting challenges? Cyber, ESG, geopolitics, data availability, regulatory change. If you could cast your votes now. Thank you.
Just 5 seconds more and we will close the poll. Okay, let's close.
Yeah. So very much, apart from the ESG, everything else is broadly the same in terms of results, which probably means they're all pretty big underwriting challenges. So thank you for that. That's really informative to ourselves as much as anything else. In terms of, so we're now going to look at market challenges. If we can just close the poll, that'd be great. Thank you. We're going to look at market challenges and pick up on 3 key areas. We actually interviewed our own CUOs or IUA member CUOs last year and looking at some of the key challenges impacting their underwriting approach. And they picked up the top, and we'll take a couple of these in turn, but the top challenge was actually around market cycles, conditions, rate adequacy, and profitability. Then we had talent, then geopolitics, then systemic risk, then kind of a general emerging risk trends. But we're going to take a couple of those in more detail. And let's look here at market conditions and rate adequacy. We have, if you take the recently published March 2025 Q2 pricing index, we're seeing, I would say, a transition, an increasing transition to softer market conditions. Overall, there's a 4% decrease in global rates, driven primarily by property, even despite a surge in 2025 cat losses. In the US, rates remain broadly flat, but everywhere else, LATAM, Europe, UK, and Asia, were all down mid-single digits. Drilling down a little more into those statistics, global property rates have decreased around 7%, workers' comp about 4%, global cyber decreased around 7%, global FinPro around 7%, and reinsurance renewal rates have decreased in between sort of 5 to 15%, depending on the loss impact programs. The slight anomaly is global casualty, which has increased around 4%, driven almost exclusively, I think, by US excess casualty, which is up significantly through 2025. So we're definitely transitioning towards softer market conditions if we're not there straight away. Different speeds and different lines of business and across different geographies, but we are seeing that general trend. But there are still growth opportunities. We are seeing some insurers walking away from unprofitable or what they consider to be unsustainable lines. It's very much a commercial balance, sustainable shareholder returns against client service. And we're also seeing more markets pushing for innovation, more different products, new approaches, and we'll talk a little more on that shortly. We've mentioned the rating drivers, geopolitics, macroeconomic concerns, net zero transition, significant increase in capacity and competition in the market, and technological acceleration, which is driving customer expectations. So that's the sort of the macro, the market developments that underpins all of our risk analysis. Moving on to claims inflation, we're certainly seeing costs increasing across the supply chain particularly, and all of the risks we've already mentioned contribute to this. Importantly, what we are seeing though is in a lot of areas decreased frequency of claims, but increased severity. So risk management is improving, but overall costs are up. Good example of this is the marine market. The size of the vessels is increasing absolutely enormously over even just the last 5 to 10 years. We're seeing significantly fewer incidents, but where those incidents occur, the severity can be far greater than we've seen, and particularly around the increased use of tech in these vessels. So none of this is a new phenomenon, but one that requires continual monitoring and focus. And we also, I think, need richer data to understand some of those key inflation indicators across different classes of business. I'm going to pass over to Tom, who's just going to mention around talent.
Yeah, and just to chip in on some of those trends, Chris, in a softer market or with softer market conditions, we often see new wordings, amendments to existing coverages proposed predominantly by broking representatives on behalf of clients. So there's quite a bit of work that we're doing to promote contract certainty and clarity throughout the wordings process, increasing understanding, promoting careful reading and thought as to the impact of changes. And what does that mean in practice? Well, we're providing regular policy wordings training for market practitioners. We have a policy wordings masterclass series that takes place 4 times a year, and those sessions are recorded and published on the IUA's YouTube channel in case they're of any value. Now, on talent, the key question is here is who will be the underwriters of the future? And we will no doubt be focusing on individuals with skills around AI, data science, and automation, all important concepts. Those skills will inevitably be in high demand across all other sectors and industries. So ultimately, we are going to be fishing in the same pond, which is one of the challenges for us to consider. Now, Chris has already mentioned our IUA work around futures, our talent work streams, and that is involving working closely with next-gen underwriting, claims, wordings, and broking representatives to support them in their development, equipping them to tackle market challenges and to think carefully and find innovative solutions around emerging risks. diversity in thought will be really important here, attracting people to the market who do have different perspectives, whether that's academia, science, or tech. Now we'll move on to take a look at really how underwriters are thinking. So we know the challenges, but for us, what was the best way to try and work out what our underwriting contacts thinking about? And that was actually through a CUO survey. So we asked them about opportunities, and it's not all bad news. They actually gave us 5 to bear in mind. We've got a few areas that we'll focus on screen. Now, of those 5, the first was prioritizing London's growth and competitiveness. The second, focusing on talent and culture, as we've just mentioned. The third was seeking solutions for climate and the energy transition. And the fourth, embracing technology and AI. And on that fourth opportunity, I'll just pause for a moment and talk about some of the key drivers behind smart underwriting that we picked up in a recent report by Artificial. So they say that the key drivers are reducing expense ratios by automating low value tasks, which I think we can all understand, enhancing data-driven decision-making with AI-powered analytics, and then accelerating product innovation by trying to shorten the time to market. So they're the drivers, but what's the suggested action? Well, first, it's to acknowledge that data-first underwriting is no longer an option. The second is noting that the tech is central, but the underwriting expertise will still be paramount. And finally, the approach of starting with high volume homogeneous risks when we start to roll out these new technologies. Now, there was one further opportunity highlighted by the CUO survey, and that was innovative cyber and then solutions around emerging risk. And Chris is going to talk about 3 of those areas that we've got on screen.
Yes, thank you, Tom. So let's look at some of the strategic underwriting solutions. There's actually a couple more than 3, but we'll pick up on those. So first one is, and these are things we're seeing in London, and I think you would see them in your markets too. But we're seeing an increased push for public-private partnerships, managing large-scale risk, mitigating disasters. It kind of depends on what risk we're talking about, but for insurers, it certainly manages our balance sheet exposures, guarantees return on capital, or at least manages return on capital, and provides the cover, more importantly, provides the cover that insurers need. So we're seeing greater push for the public-private partnerships. Captives, recent announcement by our government, we will have a new captives regime by 2027. Really pulling on London market's existing infrastructure, risk expertise to develop that market here. And generally, as a concept, we're seeing more captives. I think we're probably unlikely to see many captives redomiciling into London, but certainly new captives and probably more mid-market corporate interest. We would see that those that wouldn't normally want to be offshore. But so captive certainly is a growth area. I mentioned earlier about parametrics. Speed, simplicity, resilience. We're seeing that used in a number of areas now. One potential growth area is use in reinsurance around climate change risk. Fourthly, and probably the most important development is kind of the rise of the MGAs. We're seeing an awful lot of activity in London, and I think we're seeing that globally too. Some huge benefits to the MGA profile: speed to market, specialization, distribution access, operational efficiency. For insurers, it's generally higher margins, lower capital requirements. But certainly particularly as we move into a softer market, there are some issues. Maintaining underwriting discipline as competition rises, softer market conditions, that can be an issue. We're seeing capacity churn, particularly in some of those really competitive markets, cyber, particularly D&O, particularly. That's a potential consideration. Having MGAs in the London market, there's obviously a need to balance innovation with compliance in the regulated environment. And we're seeing some interesting dynamics with reinsurers and MGAs, particularly around the use of automated follow MGAs and the elements of risk that are then seeded into the reinsurance market. So MGA is certainly a growth area. We're seeing on-demand insurance less so, I would say. I think it's got business use in some very specific areas, but otherwise we see some fairly significant risk for relatively small premiums. So I think that's certainly one to look out for, but we're not seeing as much. And then cat bonds we also see. So, risk transfer, offloading fairly extreme losses, potentially extreme losses to capital markets instead of traditional reinsurers. We're seeing certainly more of that. It's a capacity boost because it supplements additional reinsurance programs. And actually, particularly importantly, in the current circumstances, market conditions, it can lock in certainly multi-year stability, it locks in pricing volatility for over several years. So those are some of the growth areas we're seeing. We're also seeing increasing buyer demand for risk management services. This is where insurers will increasingly be able to use data, AI to be a proactive risk partner with clients. And it has the knock-on effect for us as well, and the knock-on value. It allows us to more accurately price risks and have that risk assessment and builds our relationship with our insured clients. And we see just a couple of examples where we see this occurring. So in the war risk sector, partnerships with war risk specialists to provide real-time updates to clients, cyber vulnerability scanning, penetration testing, cyber security training, 24/7 incident response hotlines. We see it in the property and nat cat, our risk engineering visits, cat modeling tools, fire protection consulting, and we see it in environmental and climate risk around audits, sustainability consultations, and claims management around regulatory interventions. So certainly a number of growth areas for insurers and a number of opportunities. And with that, I'll pass back to Tom.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. So I'll just try and hone in here on a couple of different examples, specific product innovations that are being explored by London. Of course, there are several, but we'll just hone in on a couple. So AI and emerging risks, we've mentioned some of the specific AI coverage examples. So we'll turn our attention to emerging risk and an interesting new area of technology, electronic vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. More simply put, air taxis. You can probably all imagine. Now, air taxis might be used for short trips from an airport to a city centre, cargo flights, or for automated medical delivery. Now, there'll be specific coverages, and we know there are already specific coverages developing for this fleet of aircraft that isn't even yet in the sky. And there are some niche risks to consider around lithium-ion batteries, individuals entering the aircraft independently and unassisted, and how, in general, liability will operate, I should say, in the absence of a pilot. Now, interestingly, we asked a specialist underwriter in this area for some views around the most important risk for eVTOL. Was it managing increasingly congested airspace or hydrogen power storage? No, their view was that actually aircraft bumping into each other on the ground is going to be the most substantial risk. And even with new tech, there are some very familiar risks for the market to deal with. Now, turning to climate and biodiversity, there are likely to be opportunities around climate liability, coverage for climate-related litigation or regulatory actions, around carbon credits, offshore wind and subsea cables, environmental construction with new materials like cross-laminated timber and low-carbon concrete. Now, one specific example around biodiversity, we've seen a product emerging that aims to de-risk financing for ecological restoration and conservation projects, aiming to make biodiversity-focused solutions more investable by providing a solution that essentially supports the financial cost of restoring an ecosystem to its planned recovery path after an insured event. So really interesting innovations in these areas. And finally, reputation and intangible assets. With the increasing risk of online reputational crises and the risk of brand reputation and damage, coverage tied to cyber events or public relations may well be of growing interest that provides some support around crisis communication. And then on IP insurance, with innovation and digital assets becoming central, we're seeing more corporates potentially seeking IP infringement or defense covers. Now, as I said, just a small number of innovations here that we could cover off in the time available that are taking place across the insurance community. Now, we'll just turn to our final poll, and Chris will make a few closing remarks. around the collaborative outlook. So the poll on screen, what kind of engagement with the London market would be most valuable to you? Joint product development, technical knowledge sharing or training, access to specialist reinsurance, harmonized clauses and contract standards, regulatory and market intelligence updates. We know it may have been tempting to select a few here, but I think you've just got to make a single choice so we can see the priority area.
Okay, 5 seconds counting down. Okay, let's close it.
Chris.
Thank you, Perry. If you could leave that's the slide, the poll results up there, that would be useful. I mean, I mean that the technical knowledge sharing and training opportunities is music to our ears as a trade association. But I do think all of those elements are extremely important. If we just take a short step back and look at historically why London has become that global hub. We obviously have the expertise, centralized expertise in innovation, and we do have that ability to deal with some of the really complex, large, bespoke placements. And because of that, we have that global capacity available in London. But that is certainly not to say we're not acutely aware of the trend towards more local placements, not just in Singapore, but more widely. And we see our offering in London as complementary to that. We remain the place probably for the large, sophisticated placements, but we really do want to work with other markets, whether that's in terms of from a trade association point of view with our colleagues in Singapore, or more fundamentally from the underwriting insurance hub here in London with other hubs and clients in other sectors. So all of the items in the poll mentioned are important. The key theme across all of them, I think, is communication, building bridges. As I say, whether that's with us as associations or with insurer and broker partners. And with that in mind, I am really looking forward to being in Singapore in September and discussing some of these themes in a little more detail. But in the interim, I think that closes our comments. And I see that we do have a couple of questions on screen, which I'm happy to take one of those, Perry, if you'd like me to.
Yes, please. For example, the first one, how can the AI trend assist in risk determination and claims handling?
Well, I mean, I'll let Tom chip in as well, or indeed start if he wants to. But certainly, if we can perhaps pick up the two questions there around AI claims and AI risk management. I'll pick up on the claims aspect. So we have seen some claims around the use of AI. So there's a concept called AI hallucinations where the AI used comes up with incorrect results based on the algorithms being used, and we've seen that quite a lot in professional indemnity and in some important legal cases where we've had hallucinations around cases being cited which actually don't exist. So we've seen some litigation around that. We've also seen, I think, as Tom mentioned in his part of the presentation, on AI washing. Essentially companies overplaying their use of AI and the benefits that it brings, and therein leading to shareholder derivative actions saying you overstated that and therefore the company is not worth as much as. So we're seeing in that broad context. Tom, did you have anything you wanted to mention on the kind of risk management side?
Yeah, and I'll just make one comment on hallucinations. There's a really interesting point here, which is the fact that we typically tend to have a higher bar for technology than we do for people. So as employees, if we were working around a 2% error rate, for example, that might actually be a good performance across a month. But when it comes to AI tools and other tech, actually thinking about automated vehicles as an example, the bar that we have is incredibly high for the technology. And perhaps when it comes to hallucinations, it's because we don't quite know where and when those hallucinations will arise. Now, on the AI and the risk perspective, I mentioned the AI syndicate that we've already seen that can essentially, using the data that it has on existing policies and claims, give a risk score in real time. We've also seen assistance technologies that could look at, for example, a report on a vessel and quite quickly summarize and pull out specific issues in the report and then allocate them to a risk score that the company will have preset. So we're training that tool in order to be able to support us. Now, I know there may well be other questions that arise after this, and I'm sure Perry will reiterate this point, but we'd be really keen to have an ongoing discussion in these areas. And please do let us know, perhaps through Perry or directly, if you do have further questions or areas you want to discuss. And of course, you've got Chris flying in a little bit later in the year, but really today was an opportunity for us to open up a conversation that we hope will be an ongoing one.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Tom.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just saying, yeah, I'm very much looking forward to being in Singapore and answering any easy questions that people have got for me.
Okay, thank you so much, Tom and Chris. I know you have a very tight schedule today. On behalf of SCI, thank you so much for the wonderful insights on the London market, emerging risks and strategic responses. Slides and recording will be shared with all. If there are any unanswered questions, we will do our best to get it answered. Once again, thank you to all for your participation and support. Have a good evening ahead. And to you guys, Tom and Chris, have a good day ahead. Bye-bye. See you.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.